I spent 16 years of my career as a superintendent in Townsend, and my educational career really started in a one-room schoolhouse about 6 miles from the Canadian border, way back in first grade. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is how schools are funded, and specifically when we look at the elementary general fund budget. Our school board has determined that we're planning to run a levy for the elementary district this year. We've had a number of meeting dates, started back in September, and then on November 25th made the decision to run a levy for the elementary. Our board members that serve on our budget committee are Jan Cahill, Kim Skornagoski, and Mark Finica. As we look at levies, here's a little history, a snapshot of what's happened in our community for levies. For the general fund budgets, we passed a levy in 2005, 2006, another one in 10-11, and then another one in 14-15. And then the only other election we passed since 2005 was in 2017, 2018. We passed a bond to improve our schools. And one of the questions that comes up a lot is, why don't you just use some of that bond money to support the school? And really, bond elections are pretty specific. When you put to the voters, this is how we're going to spend the money, it's all building related. Bonds are for buildings, levies are for learning. So when we put the measure before our voters for $98.8 million, it was specifically for roofs and replacement of elementary schools and boilers and a number of those types of things. And by law, we can't spend it on salaries for our employees. So general fund budgets. The way school funding works now is 80% of our budget is guaranteed by the state. They said every school in the state's going to be at 80%, and then it's up to the local community to provide that final 20%. And as a part of my presentation, hopefully when I'm done, you'll be able to understand why there's that difference between 80% that the state does, and really the 20% is a buy-in from the local community. The local community has to have a say in their schools, and this is the way the state set it up. So if we look at the history of where we stand and how to get to that maximum budget, which is an interesting concept that hopefully will make sense to you when I get through my presentation. But as we stand right now, a little bit of a history. In 2015, 2016, if we were to go to the voters and say, we could have run a levy for $670,000, and then we would have been at that full maximum budget. By 1920, it's like $1.3 million in order in the elementary to get to the maximum budget. In the high school, it looks like a different story there. The amounts are a lot smaller. And one thing to know about school funding is it's really based on the number of students that attend the school. Student numbers are huge, and what we've had kind of historically in our district is elementary's been increasing, high school's been declining very slowly. So that partially explains what's going on with these numbers. When we look at the tax impact, that's another big question we get in school funding is, what's it going to cost me? And taxable valuation is a fancy number for the value of all the property in Cascade County in our district. So in the elementary, it's $145 million, and that includes all the houses, all the businesses, everything that's taxed. So for each $1 million that the school requests in taxes, it's $9.29 per year for a $100,000 value house. So your house is worth $200,000, you double that amount. So we use currently are using about $1.3 million because that's what it could have been last year for our levy. And looking at that, it works out to be $12.40 per year on a $100,000 house, which is $1.03 per month. This is an interesting slide that shows how schools are funded too. When we look at the elementary budget for our district, and this is a general fund budget, it's $47.8 million. And of that 47.8, just under $34 million comes directly from the state. Property tax on the local level is just under $14 million. Of the $14 million, if you're a homeowner, homeowners, residential, the piece of the pie that residents pay on that, $13.8 million is $5.7 million. So all the houses in our district, when it's all added up together, contribute about $5.7 million worth of funding for our district. So our funding components, the biggest thing I want you to take away is that it's really based on students. And this is a chart that we use that shows the yellow money is money that comes from the state, and all those arrows are student-related components. That if you have a student, we get a small amount of money for special education, for data for achievement, for Indian Ed for All. So all those add up to get our total budget. The red section up there is our local share. It's the one that our voters have said, we're going to support this levy, and when they do, that gets added to that top part of the budget. So for me as business manager, there are moving parts. From year to year, the biggest moving parts are student enrollment. Is it going up? Is it going down? If I was in a district like Bozeman, that's a great district to be in because the student numbers go up every year. If you're in a district that's declining, it's a lot harder to make the ends meet. Local levies are also a moving part. If we decide to run a levy and it passes, that's huge for our operation. Health insurance costs, a lot of you have businesses and have experienced the double-digit increases. That's huge on the school. Any increase in health insurance right now is split half between the employees and half goes to the district. So when you have a double-digit increase in health insurance, that's huge. The other one that I just want to take a second and talk about is this taxable valuation. If you were with the county government, so to speak, and the taxable valuation goes up, that's a great thing for your budget because your budget increases with the taxable valuation. Since schools are funded by students, the numbers of students, taxable valuation has no impact on our budget. So if the taxable valuation, let's say they put in another dam or Calumet expanded, it doesn't increase our budget at all because it's based solely on a formula that's student driven. To bring this all together, I want to talk about how schools are funded, and this hopefully as you see this next few slides, it'll bring together that 80% and 100%. And really in school funding, if you stay at 30,000 feet, it's pretty easy to understand. When you start getting lower and getting into the details, it gets pretty complex very fast. So for my presentation today, I'm going to stay at about 30,000 feet. And really, all you need to know about school funding is probably found on this slide right here. And just know that decisions on school funding are made at the state capitol. Every 2 years, the legislature meets and they make tweaks to the school funding system. Since 1989, our state has had a variety of impacts on the economy. We've had great economy. If we look at the state of Montana, in the upper eastern Montana, there's an oil derrick there, that's an oil boom, good for the state. We've also had forest fires that have caused us problems at the state level, and those generally come down to the school level as well. Also, the southeastern Montana, that little black dot is supposed to be a piece of coal, and I think we'll find out very quickly the impact that Colstrip has on our state revenue and state budget. And like I said earlier, if you see the student and the dollar sign, know that the dollars that schools get to operate on have everything to do with the number of students in the school. Through the course from 1989, know that you can see the political party symbols there. We've probably had every combination of Republican governor, Democratic governor, House and Senate controlled by each party, a split, those types of things. And all of those things have somewhat of an impact on school funding. The other part is that this is Great Falls High, and I picture this as Ulm. There was a lawsuit in 1989 that said schools had to be funded equally. And one of the big challenges the legislature had was, we've got a school the size of Ulm and one the size of Great Falls. How do we create a formula that equalizes funding between those two schools? So big picture, they had to make sure that funding was fair for every student in the state of Montana. The other impact here is voters. It's how are the votes on levies? How have they turned out for any district in the state of Montana? And who do they send to Helena? Who that make our decisions on how schools are funded? And probably the biggest one, I put it in the middle for a reason, is the legal system got involved in funding. And if we go back to 1989, just for memory purposes, that was the year we had our centennial. That might put things in perspective. But some of the things going on in the country and in the world were that the Berlin Wall came down 1989. The Tiananmen Square incident in China happened in 1989. Also importantly, it was the year that Microsoft Office came out with their suite of products, word processing, Excel, databases. Now, if you put it in the school context, imagine being in a school that had a lot of money at that time and comparing yourself to a school that had no money. So I've got a kid in a school that has no access to those computer programs, and they're just coming out. What chance is my kid going to have in the future if they've never been exposed to it, comparatively to that kid that has been exposed to those, that has, you take it back to that time, the rich school had the new computer lab, had the new buses, had the new textbooks, new uniforms for their teams. The poor schools had curriculum, textbooks that were 15 years old, fallen apart, buses that could barely run. So a pretty significant divide in the state of Montana. Interest rates were 10.5%. And today we look at that and say, wow, that was really high. And I started teaching in 1982, and I bought my first car, and I paid 18%. So from 1982 to 1989, came down from 18 to 10.5, which is significant when we look at that. So just perspective time-wise, what was going on in our state. So state support, again, the courts got involved and said, the system's broken. We need to come up with a new system for funding schools in Montana. So in order to do that, they said, what's the landscape? What are we looking at right now? And this is for demonstrative purposes. And imagine when I talked about rich communities and poor communities, if you were in a rich community, it was probably mineral wealth. Broadus at the time, I spent 6 years of my educational career there, had the richest oil well in the state of Montana. So that paid most of the school taxes. That paid the bill. So they had a lot of good things. Greyhound buses to travel, nice auditorium for a small school, a lot of things like that. Great curriculum. So they would have been one that probably spent about $10,500 per student. There's also parts of the state that were very poor and had little community support, spent about $2,800 per student. So you can see the significance between those two numbers and what was offered for every student in the state of Montana. To start with, the legislature said, okay, we see there's rich spending schools and schools that don't spend a lot of money. Let's come up with a solution. So they said, all right, let's start with the average. What's the average that's spent per student? If we take our rich and our poor, put it together, and they came up with an average, and that became known as the maximum budget. So when we say 100% or maximum budget, perspective-wise, that's the average that was spent in 1989. The state said, all right, so we've got a number we can work with, and we've got to close that divide between rich spending districts and poor spending districts. So they said, we'll create a window, and we'll take 100%, we know that number, and we'll move it down to 80% of the average. So now we're going to require that all schools spend within this window. So in order to do that, schools had 3 years. Schools that spend a lot of money had to come down. And again, it's based on student numbers. Schools that weren't spending very much money were required to get up inside that window between 80 and 100%. So at the time, I happened to be in one of these schools. Do you think that was a good situation to be in? No, we had to make cuts. I remember we did a reduction in force. We had a history teacher that had taught in the district for 25 years, and we had to let him go. So that wasn't a good situation. I moved from Broadus to Townsend. Townsend happened to be in this realm. Would that be a good place to be? It was, because they had a bunch of new money. They had been living on next to nothing forever, and now we're required to have a bigger budget. The other thing that happened in Townsend is student numbers were rising. So kind of the best of two worlds. So if we look at our district, just a big picture look at our district, we look every year at what does it cost to move the exact employees we have from this year to the next year. That's our starting point of saying, if we were to take our current staff, move them from one year to the other, we come up with a projected rollover cost. And in 1920, that was projected to be about $1.3 million. In 2018-19, $1.9 million. 16-17, $1.1 million. So the average of all those is about $1.5 million. On the other hand, it's like how much money's coming in from the state. When we do our enrollment count and the dust settles, how much money comes from the state? 1920, we got just about 650,000, about 550,000, 327,000, 630. So the average is just under 540,000. Sometimes I say to myself, do I have a great job? Yes, I've got a great job, except for this fact that you don't have to be an amazing business person to say, if you have to roll over, it costs $1.5 million and you've got 540,000 coming in, life gets a lot harder. So when we look at trying to budget for next year and looking at the big picture, this year the board budget committee said we've got to start a lot earlier. You've got to get numbers in front of us so we know how to project, because usually we wait till the second enrollment count, find out what the numbers are and say, oh, okay, here's what we need to do. So they challenged me this year and I looked at a 4-year average, and that's the numbers I just talked about as one scenario. So in looking how it had set up, first the revenue side of it, our current elementary and high school budgets combined to about $71.5 million. If we use that 539,000, that tells us how much money we're working with. The expense side, again, we start with our existing budget, project our expenses, and that was at $1.5 million. When we add these together and compare it to revenues versus expenses, if we look at what's happened over the last 4 years, we're about $1 million behind. So big picture, that's one way to look at where we stand. Another one would be, let's say we ran a levy and the levy passed. We ran a levy for $1.3 million. It passes, same scenario, start with your revenues, add the levy, and then get the total revenues, expenses, what it costs to roll over. We're about $25,000 difference. So that's pretty good in my world. That's pretty close. This year in the contracts for our staff, we've got, if we run a levy and it passes, they get a 2% increase. If we don't run a levy or the levy fails, it's a 1.5% increase for our staff. So the difference there, 1.5 wage increase for every employee in the district works out to be about $750,000, and a 2% works out to be $1 million. And the reason that's important as far as paying staff is our goal is to hire good people. And you can imagine if you were a college student right now graduating and you've got $40,000 to $50,000 in debt, and you say, where will I go work? I'm going to go, that most enticing place is the one that pays you the highest salary. So when we fall behind on that, those excellent students start coming out and going to places that pay more money. So, and also retaining our existing staff. We've got some great people that work at Great Falls Public Schools. We don't want them leaving to go somewhere else to work. So 2%, we're definitely not in 1989 when interest rates were at 10.5%. So the last scenario deals with no levy. Again, start with the revenue, look at again at the average, and then 1.5% increase. We're about $1.1 million behind the 8 ball. Also get asked, how do you compare with other AA districts? In looking at that, we are below the average. You can see by this that Missoula, Kalispell, and Helena are the schools that spend probably above the average. We fall right here where we're 36.5 mils below the average of every AA district in the state. This chart will get updated because Belgrade just became a AA school. But that just gives you a picture of how we compare in Great Falls to all the other AA districts. So just to recap, I want to close with, when you look at the school funding formula, again, the law is designed that local participation is supposed to be that 20%. It's the community buy-in to the school and the students in the district. It comes with it good news and bad news, is that once we get to the 100%, the law says you really can't go above it. Because imagine if you're in a rich district and you got to that top window, which is the average, and then levied more money, you're again going to move to that situation where we've got really rich districts and really poor districts. So if we were to pass a levy for $1.3, $1.4 million or 1.5, depending on how the second enrollment count comes out, and we get to this average, we probably won't be coming back to the taxpayers for another levy. So looking at that, 80% from the state, 20% at the local level.